Political commentator Alastair Ramsay is known for his thoughtful assessments of issues which face our island. So what's got into him lately? Alastair doesn't hold back on this week's programme about his deep concerns over the process which has led to the proposed site in the south for a wind farm development. I think it's important that I clarify that the proposed development is close to where I live, but I hope you'll agree that in this interview I remain impartial. I asked Alastair, why is he being so politically forthright?
Yes, well, I am, for my sins, a political commentator these days of sorts. And what strikes me about this affair is that ultimately it's about whether the island plan has now usurped the authority of Tynwald. The appearance of giant wind turbines, each one the height of Peel Hill, would be the biggest change to the Manx landscape for many centuries. And I think the island could only move towards that great transformation with the approval of its highest authority, which is Tynwald, I think, and with the consent of its people. But in this case, the Council of Ministers has bypassed the Parliament and the public in starting the process to bring wind turbines to the Isle of Man. And I think that leaves it politically exposed, and I think its policy lacks legitimacy.
And yet, government would not unreasonably say there are documents that have been through Tynwald, have had Tynwald approval. The Isle of Man government's plan that has been supported by Tynwald, has been discussed and produced, I'm told, by Tynwald members actively sitting around in I don't know what's a collective of MHKs, gaggles of MHKs.
Yeah, workshops.
And they have come up with these ideas as the way forward for the Isle of Man. So surely to goodness, there's only so much debate you can have on these things. I mean, we had last October the Climate Change Action Plan. That must have been debated and discussed, and indeed in that plan there is a requirement for 20 megawatts of onshore renewables.
Yeah, but onshore wind farms are a distinct and a separate and significant political issue. That they have not been debated. The principle of that has not been debated. There's no clear reference to that in these documents, unless you're inside the bubble and you knew what it meant. So the idea that the inference of the small print of a document gives authority for a major policy is just not acceptable.
Is it, though, not something... I mean, the whole concept or principle of onshore wind farms has been being discussed by various governments over the last possibly 10, maybe even 15 years. I know I was pushing for them when I was Minister and chair of the then Council of Ministers Environment and Infrastructure Committee. So it's not a new concept, this.
Well, that may have happened behind closed doors, but if you actually examine the records, there's been no public debate about this, because I guess people knew it was controversial, or maybe they're just totally politically naive. But, I mean, I've been watching Manx politics for 40 years, and it was always understood that if you had a major policy issue that was separately addressed, debated with the public and in Tynwald, and then it needed clear approval before the government could go ahead with it. That hasn't happened here, and I've never seen anything like it.
I mean, that's quite an extraordinary thing to say, that you've in 40 years you've never seen anything like this.
No, I haven't. I really haven't. It sounds like hyperbole, but I mean, what we've ended up here with is a fait accompli. The government apparently has a policy in favour of onshore wind farms. They must have, because they've just given, earlier this year, they gave the go-ahead for that. It's not at all clear where that policy came from. It's never been explained. It's never been explicitly debated and approved in Tynwald. It seems to have been smuggled through Tynwald by some invisible process that only members of the Council of Ministers could see. And to me, policy smuggling and invisible processes is not open and transparent government.
Is it? I mean, we elect MHKs, don't we, to represent us and to make decisions on our behalf. Is it not reasonable that those MHKs could have met, admittedly behind closed doors, and had these sorts of discussions, and then decided this indeed is the way forward?
No, that's not acceptable at all. The Isle of Man Parliament, Tynwald is signed up to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association standard of best practice, which says that members should act and take decisions in an open and transparent manner. I think this kind of, logical implication of a document that we should have all read from cover to cover, sorry mate, you should have read the small print. That's political sharp practice. And it is completely different culture from what has happened in the past. And I think the island plan is becoming more important than Tynwald.
And I suppose trying to consider then the Tynwald process and how Isle of Man government reacts with that. Sadly, Tynwald chose not to follow any of the recommendations that Lord Lisvane came forward to give a little bit more power to Tynwald. Why does it matter in our non-party political system that Tynwald has a greater say? And I'm sort of leading you into this a bit.
Yeah, well, because the politicians, the government, the Council of Ministers, has no clear public mandate for what it's doing. So at each stage where it's making major policy changes, and this government is making more changes than any other I can remember, that it's done properly, there's a quality of decision making, it involves the public, and the public understand what's going on. It's not, well, it's on page whatever of the plan, it's got to happen. I mean, that's a kind of autocratic, almost totalitarian approach.
I mean, to a certain extent, I imagine, if the Chief Minister were listening to this, he would, first of all, be pleased that you think this government is making more decisions, big decisions, than any previous government, because effectively that's the stall he has laid out, that he wants to deliver significant change. Is that unreasonable of him?
No, but he has to have a mandate for that. And in the absence of a direct public mandate, the Parliament has to challenge, test and assess what he's doing, and they don't do it.
So looking then at the specific concerns that you have about the proposal, I suppose, were the wind farms sited elsewhere on the Isle of Man in a less important position in terms of its scenic value or biodiversity, would you be happy with that?
Well, it's not really down to me. I think the key point is that it would be a major change for the island, and that needs to be considered properly. There are policy issues around this. I mean, big wind farms are not permitted in UK national parks, for example, so that they do have an impact on the landscape. The idea of, you'll get used to them, they'll make it look better, is not accepted in places like the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. So there's a policy choice there. Now, it may be that what the government is doing is absolutely necessary for the good of the island and our international responsibilities and so on. But if that's the case, they have to explain that to the public and through a proper debate. You just don't, you don't jump the gun and just crack on and do it because it's in a document that the public don't read. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is not acceptable.
At some point, the MUA is going to have to come back to Tynwald to actually get the necessary funding to allow this to happen.
Yeah.
Is that not the more appropriate time to have the debate?
That's going to be interesting, and I think they'll struggle there because there's a lot of concern at the moment about government spending, especially, post-Liverpool terminal. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for them. But nevertheless, if you're arguing about the money, you've still accepted the policy by default. And the same with an argument about any particular site. You've still, the policy has still been smuggled in by the back door, and you haven't had that proper national debate about whether these things are suitable, whether we have a choice, what the value of the uplands is in terms of natural beauty, quality of life for people, an attraction for tourists and new residents that we're supposed to be going for. Do we treat our uplands as an equivalent of the UK national parks? Do we respect them in that way? Or do we say, well, sorry, mate, they're not that special? There's all sorts of issues there that they have just bypassed, and I find it incredible, actually.
The planning system, as it currently exists at least, does offer some protection, doesn't it, though? You can't develop industrial scale developments in areas that aren't designated for that unless there is an absolute national need.
Yeah. Yes, and on the face of it, I'm no planning expert, and I'm no expert on the technical side of wind farms. But on the face of it, the planning system doesn't provide for onshore wind developments of any size. So having gone through all this process, government at the end of it would have to accept that it can't go ahead, in which case, if they'd read the strategic plan first, it might have saved a lot of trouble. Or they're going to have to override the planning outcome in the national interest, which again is a political decision. You can't just leave it to the planning process to resolve a major policy issue.
So is it then coincidental, perhaps, that the Isle of Man strategic plan is currently being reviewed with a view to radical and significant change?
It looks fishy, doesn't it? But I think it was due for a review. But again, that's a big policy debate about the future of the island, how we want it to look. Unfortunately, it sounds boring and technical, and nobody seems to pay much attention to it. But again, these are big policy issues.
Is Tynwald up to the job?
I'm not confident that it is up to the job at the moment of being an independent parliament, and I think this issue will test its authority in a way that hasn't happened for a long time. And again, has it got authority over the island plan, or has the island plan got authority above Tynwald? In which case, and I hate this kind of, it sounds like a massive exaggeration, but in which case we're a kind of one-party state.
So you've finally been won over by Peter Carron's jibe that the Isle of Man is a one-party state by patronage.
Good old Peter. We do miss him, don't we? He went over the top. He was the bane of a lot of people's lives, but there isn't anything like him now. The kind of guard dogs that bark when they think something's going wrong, and I am really worried about the quality of our good governance in the Isle of Man.
Again, that's quite an extraordinary thing to say, particularly as someone who has been around at various times. Obviously we've had the scandal of the MUA borrowing money when perhaps it didn't have the necessary authority.
I remember that one too. Yes.
We've had the Mount Murray, and all these things have happened in the past, and you still think that the current government, I'm perhaps putting words into your mouth, is worse than on those occasions?
I wouldn't say worse. I say the government is doing its best, and it's got strong leadership and direction now, which is fine. It might be heading in the right direction. It might not. It might be betting the farm. It looks that way to some people, but what they're doing needs to be challenged and tested so we can be reassured that everything is heading in the right direction. And with a strong government like that, you do need a strong mechanism to assess what it's doing. And because we've now got the island plan almost in place of Tynwald debate, it's potentially quite dangerous situation. I mean, I don't like making these extreme statements because I like to think of myself as a reasonable person, but I find myself being quite alarmed, actually.
So, looking then at the whole situation, I mean, let's assume that Tynwald actually sort of decides, actually, yeah, okay, maybe Alastair's right here, we do need a debate.
That's very unlikely.
The debate happens, and actually Tynwald members turn round and say, you know what, when we were out knocking on doors at the last election, a lot of people told us that actually we do need to be moving to more renewable energy.
I'm sure people did, yeah.
And actually, we think that the loss of certain parts of our uplands is a reasonable thing. Does that then negate your argument because actually Tynwald has had that reasoned debate?
I think if they had a reasonable, informed and clear debate after a period of public conversation about it, I mean, you'd expect that. They'd need to take that into account. They need to think about it, and they make there's a clear outcome. I wouldn't like it, but if there was no other way for the Isle of Man, I think reasonable people would have to accept that. But they just haven't even begun to present that argument. There's a kind of assumed consent, either because it comes in a green wrapping or because it's in the island plan.
So presumably, if Isle of Man government is cracking on with onshore renewables, and we're told that Isle of Man government's having conversations with Ørsted about an offshore wind farm, presumably legislation is in place to give us the comfort that these things are going to be developed appropriately, and there's going to be an appropriate way of operating them.
I don't know the answer to that, but part of me doubts it.
Okay. So there is the potential then of debate in Tynwald. Obviously, Jason Moorhouse has a motion down, I think a couple of motions down this in this month's Tynwald, one of which is specifically addressing this issue of protecting the uplands. Will that go some way at least to allowing Tynwald to have made a conscious choice on this?
I think it's the beginning of it. It'll be very interesting to see if the members are queuing up to say, oh yes, we have approved this policy, and don't you remember we did it on such and such a day? I can't see that happening, because if they did that, nobody else noticed them doing that. But at least Jason's motion picks up on one of the issues around this that should be taken into account and clearly hasn't been, and hopefully that will put it back to the Council of Ministers with the message, look at this again, guys, and do it properly. Come back to us with a proper argument so we can have a proper conversation and debate about this.
Again, the MUA will say that they have undertaken a very rigorous process to try and find the ideal site for this this onshore wind farm. They have discussed this with all the agencies of government that may be affected by this, and ultimately they ended up with 3 sites, one of which they couldn't really access properly, which one does wonder then how could that have been a preferred site. The second favoured site was had the potential of polluting our main water supply, but we were left with this one site in the south of the island. Do government departments and agencies not have the best interests of the Isle of Man at heart?
I'm sure they do, and I don't blame the MUA. I think they've been given a hospital pass by the Council of Ministers. But that's a technical process. It's not a political. The policy should come first. The national debate about how do we approach this big issue. This is going to be a big change for the Isle of Man. Do we have to do it? What's the best way we do it? Once you've got the policy established, then you do the technical process about where you put them, and this idea that consulting with the local residents, once the thing is a fait accompli, is any form of, adequate consultation. And they talk about mitigating the impact. Well, how do you mitigate something 500 feet high? Take a couple of inches off the top and everyone will be happy, presumably.
But with something like this, and I'm sure there have been other developments that have taken place around the island, there is an inevitability that people close by are going to have various concerns.
Oh, yeah.
And, they are readily dismissed as NIMBYs. I would probably have readily dismissed them as NIMBYs myself until this recent application, which clearly is in my backyard, and I've already declared that at the start of the programme. Ultimately, government is there to make the right decisions on behalf of the Manx public to ensure that we have a secure future.
With the approval of the Parliament, with the clear approval of the Parliament, not the, it's the logical implication of one of the lines in the island plan, and you should have realised that, you should have been paying attention. That really isn't acceptable. But the thing about the NIMBYs is it's quite ironic, because I got into a lot of trouble a couple of years ago for writing an article attacking NIMBYs around housing developments. And I think there are people, it's not just in that local area, and I do sympathise with those people because their lives have been turned upside down, but there are people across the island who are concerned about the future of the Manx countryside. And that's, if being concerned about the landscape of your nation is NIMBYism, then, I give up.
And one of the things that we are regularly told, of course, that attracts people to come and work and live on the Isle of Man is the fantastic place in which we live, the wonderful landscape and the environment. Yes,
I think that's come out of various surveys in the past, and the quality of life, which governments in the past were very much aware of. They weren't quite as blinkered as this current regime, that they took into account kind of senses of identity and culture, quality of life issues, in a way that you just don't get mentioned anymore. And yet we're looking to attract lots more people to the place. There are all sorts of implications to that in terms of cohesion of the community. And if it's being discussed, it's not being discussed in public.
So then, we're running sadly towards the end of the programme, but what would your appeal be to Tynwald members, or indeed the council of ministers, if they happen to be listening to this programme?
I think to Tynwald members, the appeal would be just, and it's not for me to lecture them, but they do have a responsibility to make sure that government is doing the right thing, that things are thought through properly for everyone's sakes, and that we have a proper debate, national debate about important issues.
And for council of ministers, any advice there?
I think just be aware of the broader politics of this, and don't just be blindly following the island plan. This is not Stalin's Russia.
And again, that's quite an extreme thing.
It is.
I mean, suggest,
quite extreme form today, unfortunately.
Yeah. The Isle of Man government chief minister will say that he was elected with a mandate to make these big decisions and actually change the island.
But not by the public. That's our system. The chief minister doesn't have any public mandate whatsoever, and that's our system. Our system has many strengths, but we have to be careful with strong governments that they're kept in check without stopping everything in its tracks.
That was political commentator Alastair Ramsay. Is Alastair right to be so concerned? Surely we've been talking about wind farms long enough now, and it's time for action. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn. Goram Mayo. Thanks for listening.